Afternoon, everybody. So apologies, we are having some technical issues. That's why we're a bit late. Again, welcome you all. A lovely afternoon here in Bangladesh, and Keshab is in Sydney. And hello everybody. So good afternoon if you are in South Asia, and good evening if you are in Australia. So welcome our fortnight seminar at GPPSN. Today we have Dr. Keshab here with us. He's going to present his paper titled "Making Feminist Sense of COVID in Nepal." So let me give you a brief introduction of Dr. Keshab. Dr. Keshab is a postgraduate course coordinator, Department of Government and International Relations, the University of Sydney, and also a lecturer at CIEE Sydney. His research interest basically includes gender and war, human combats, political violence, violence extremism, civil war, and peace building. So first, Dr. Keshab is going to present his paper for around 30 minutes. Then the floor is open for question and answer. You can also type your question in the chat box as well. And please do turn off your sound while session is moving on. And then when the speaker finishes talk, then you can raise your hand, or you can turn on your sound or video, and you can ask questions to us. Thank you. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Keshab. He's going to present his paper today.
Thank you, Shakib, and the GPPSN team for inviting me for the presentation. As Shakib generously introduced me, I'm a sessional lecturer at the University of Sydney, and I also teach at CIEE. I did my doctoral degree on women combatants during the Maoist insurgency in Nepal, exploring their experiences of war and so-called post-war period through intersectional lens. So my apologies, I'm trying to share the slides that I have with you so that it will make you easier to follow my presentation. But it seems I'm having problem. I'll try my best to present because I have some pictures, data that I think will be better to share with you. And let me try once, and if not, I will have to find another way to present it. Probably I will go to my laptop where the video will not be of good quality, but nevertheless I need to do the presentation. Let me try once, okay? Bear with me for a second. So you can see on the screen that this is gender disaggregated data on the contraction rate in South Asia. And this data shows that men are more likely to contract COVID-19 compared to women, except for the case of Bhutan. But if you look at worldwide data on this COVID-19, the contraction rate for men and women is almost equal. So why do we care when men are more likely to contract virus, at least in the case of South Asia, and when the mortality rate for men is much higher than women? So the big question here is that why does gender matter? Okay, so why does gender matter in the study of COVID-19? One immediate answer would be gender does not equal to women, but I will provide more comprehensive answer later. And second thing would be, how do we account for gender in the study of COVID-19? Right? How do we use gender lens to make sense of this pandemic? I'll be looking at case of Nepal to answer these three questions. Okay, so just she was brutally murdered, right? When there was lockdown, and she wanted to come back to her parents' home, and because of pandemic, she couldn't do that because her parents' home is 234 kilometers to the west of her in-laws' home, and she was murdered in most brutal manner, and she was sexually assaulted before her murder, and her in-laws tried to make this case as a case of suicide, but later it was found out that it was murder. And she's just a representative case. In the first 2 months of the lockdown, 400 women were murdered. They committed suicide, and we don't know whether they were murdered or and it was just a case of suicide, as it happened in the case of Susmita Thapa here. So making feminist sense of COVID-19 means that we need to change our ontological lens. It does not mean only counting the bodies contracted that contracted virus. It does not mean counting the body that succumbed to the virus, but it also means looking at long-term impact, what I call secondary impact of the COVID-19. So this is the structure of my presentation, what I am going to achieve. First, I will give a gender and COVID-19 an overview, and second, I'm talking about public health emergencies and gender, what lessons were there for us looking at HIV, Ebola, and Zika. And then I'll talk about COVID-19 and gender, looking at it from biological, socioeconomic, and political perspectives. And finally, I'll give you an example of gender in Nepal during the COVID-19, and I'll look at through intersectional theoretical perspective. So just to give you a snapshot of what's happening right after the COVID-19, after the onset of pandemic. So, and what kind of vulnerabilities that are being faced by women. So women constitute a 2/3 of all part-time casual employment, and they represent 85% of for-profit employment. And women not only comprise 70% of global health care workforce, they also dominate social care and civil society sector. And if you look at the sector that are being hit by or impacted by the pandemic, women are most likely to lose a job because they're working as part-time and casual employment, and these kind of job, they do not have job security. And they are in the front line battling pandemic. So although 70% of global healthcare workforce is women, they do not represent the employment at the top level. So they do not have as much decision-making power as men. And so these are data from different parts of the world. Okay, in China, Hubei, France, which is a province where the COVID-19 started, women healthcare workers represent 90% of the workforce, and in the US it is around 78%. And women are at least 3 times more likely to experience violence from an intimate partner than women. That is the data from Australia. And I'm pretty sure that this pattern is same elsewhere as well. And after this pandemic, there has been sharp rises in cases in Asia and in Australia, and this is the case everywhere in South Asia, in North America, in Europe, everywhere. These are hyperlinked, and if anyone interested, I can share the slide, and you can find the source for the, if you want to source on this. Okay, so I think it is really important to look at public health emergencies and how it intersects with gender and human right. Okay, so health is a human right, and this is reinforced by WHO Charter. It is mentioned in UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And this is also reinforced by ECSCR, that means Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And nobody should be deprived of healthcare service. But this healthcare service is equal to everyone. Okay, and during pandemic or during any kind of crisis, existing inequalities become compounded, and those who are in the margin, those who are marginalized group, like and other group, other group, they are more likely to be affected. And also there is this burden of social production, which often falls squarely on women. And I will come back to this idea of social reproduction, looking at this from feminist political economic perspective later. HIV disease, HIV pandemic earlier, HIV public health emergency earlier, and gender analysis also shows that initially women are initially in the response to the public health emergency, international health governance is less likely to take gender lens to look at the crisis. And initially it was said that it's only men who are affected, especially the gay men, LGBTQI community, and it is not a problem. But later, with the more research on it, it was shown that majority of HIV positive people, they live in sub-Saharan Africa, and majority of women in sub-Saharan Africa, they have this HIV. If we had detected this earlier, this wouldn't have been the case. And global health policy and programs are often, they are blind to differences between women's needs, men's needs, and to women's unequal position in society, rendered women conspicuously invisible. We can look at COVID and gender from gender impact of COVID-19 from different feminist analysis. But we can take biological perspective. That means looking at disease transmission vulnerability. The research shows that looking at it from hormonal, doing research on hormonal level and immunology, women have this high immune power that because of that, these are explanation, okay, biological explanation, that they are less likely to get contracted. And then there is one particular protein, ACE2, and that is high in men, and because of that, the vital organ in men, they are more likely to receive COVID-19 virus. And another, and that is one perspective that that could throw some light on why men contract this disease higher rate than women, why they are more likely to succumb to virus. This is just one perspective, okay? This is not a whole thing. So, and in terms of crisis, looking at HIV positive, looking at Ebola, looking at Zika, public health emergency, reproductive and maternal health, they take hit, okay? They are less likely to be taken care of, and the priorities lies somewhere else. And because of that, a lot of women die, especially in looking at Ebola in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. More women died because of this, while giving birth, than people dying from Ebola, because this health issue was not highlighted at that time. And also similar goes with the case of mental health, although not many people die because of mental health, but there are problems. Nevertheless, this part is less highlighted. But if you look at the suicide rate, and that is partly driven by the mental problem, compounded by the pandemic, we have to be really serious, because the lives lost because of this are much higher. Looking at this is more kind of immediate impact, okay, primary impact of COVID-19, but there are other secondary impact, long-term impact, and this can be seen from socioeconomic perspective, a political perspective, and epistemic perspective. Socioeconomic perspective, as I mentioned earlier, women are more likely to lose job, and employment prospects for them are bleak because their education is often disrupted. They have to share disproportionate amount of household burden at home. And this is the case for every country, even the developed countries like Australia. I will show the data later. They are more likely to share the household burden, even when they are primary income earner in the family. And obviously, there's a spike in gender-based violence because of the pandemic. And the social reproduction burden means that it is not only about biological reproduction, but also totality of everyday experiences and long-term structural processes that is required to biological reproduction as well as sustenance of life. It is not only about looking after, giving birth to children and looking after and caring for them, but also enabling other function in society and production at society. And if you look at this from a feminist political economic perspective, or even from socialist feminist perspective, capitalism relies on unpaid labor of women for capitalism to sustain. Like without unpaid labor from women, capitalism just crumbles. So social reproduction burden also helps us to understand, making sense of COVID-19 and its impact in society, particularly. And education is disrupted, as we know. We cannot go, many men, women, and others, they cannot go to school. And as a result, since they cannot do jobs, since they cannot go to school or colleges, in many cases they are married away in earlier age, and that results in unwanted pregnancies. And there is research. Okay, I have compiled a complete reference list at the end of the presentation. You can, if you are interested, you can find more sources in there. And also, it has impact on political engagement for women, since they cannot, lack of employment, lack of education also reduces chances for engagement outside home, and then that also negatively impacts prospect for political engagement, political activism. And the most important part is epistemic perspective. What does epistemic perspective means? It is something related to knowledge. First, we do not have data, okay? We do not have data. the best data on COVID-19 that provides us sex disaggregated data is Global Health 50/50, which is a massive project. But nevertheless, if you scroll down the data set, not many people, not many countries provide, gender disaggregated data. It is only sex disaggregated data. It does not provide gender disaggregated data. And also, you might have seen the reports that shows that women academics, they are less likely, they are not been able to produce as much research output as they were before the pandemic, because of the household burden that falls disproportionately on women. And because since we cannot have women's perspective, and we do not have data to account for experiences of women, there is this skewed knowledge production that comes from a perspective of men, and in the long term, that reinforces the inequality in society. Okay, this is the just reinforcing. I'm just substantiating my claim through data here. So women are more likely to contract virus while working in healthcare sector, and this is the data from the first world countries, right? Italy, the USA, Spain, and Germany. If you look at the proportion of female workers, healthcare workers, that they are more likely to contract COVID-19. And this is HILDA, that is household income and labor data dynamics survey Australia, that shows that women are more likely to have this household burden on them, and that is the case even for women if they are breadwinner, right, in society, in household. And second one shows that the parents are more likely to, the orange one is parent only. After the pandemic, during the pandemic, right, so their share of burden has skyrocketed. This means women have more care work burden at the household level. And then I raised a question earlier, right? Why men are more likely to contract virus, especially in the case of South Asia. Globally, if you look at the data, the contraction rate is more or less similar, but more men are dying because of COVID-19. The first explanation is biological perspective. That is, I already explained, immunological and hormonal profile, and then because of evolution, they are more likely to, their immune system is more likely to sturdier than men. And ACE2 receptor, the protein in the body, that is more in men, and because of that, it is more likely to receive COVID-19 virus. But this is the part of explanation, and this is more kind of deceptive. We have to look at more kind of gendered behavior, lifestyle, and environment. I'll show the data later, this data show that men are more likely to drink alcohol, they're more likely to smoke, and they are more likely to be exposed to the pollution outside, because it's men who mostly do the household work, and men most likely to do work outside home. I'm not trying to essentializing experience of men and women. I'm just saying because of that, they are more likely to contract. Men are more likely to contract the virus. It is gendered behavior. And also, we need to be really careful in analyzing data, because we have to look at our society, who is most likely to be taken care of, right? I have, in my family, my sister could not go to school because my parents thought that her education is less important than my brother's education. Same goes with healthcare, right? And then my family is not the exception here. Compared to boys, girls are less likely to be paid attention to in terms of education, healthcare, and other aspects, right? So in terms of testing as well, in responding to disease as well, women are less likely to be tested, they're less likely to be diagnosed, they're less likely to be treated. That could partly explain, okay, it's not the total kind of explanation, that could partly explain why the infection rate for women is lesser than men. And we have to also take into account additional structural inequalities, for example, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, geography, disability, and diseases, all those different system of inequalities that has impact, compounding impact on the effect of COVID-19. I'm happy to come back to this later in Q&A if you want to discuss this further. Okay, here is just a diagram that shows why more men get contracted COVID-19 and why more men are dying. This is comorbidities. They have more kind of heart disease. Men get more heart disease, more stroke, and chronic so different kind of diseases, morbidities is higher in men, and we have to look at gender behavior, and also we have to look at structural factor to explain this. In no way this data is self-explanatory. And then smoking rate, again, you can see men disproportionately smoke higher, they have a smoking habit higher than women. And alcohol consumption, same goes with alcohol consumption, right? This data is global data. Okay, I will sort of now apply this analysis into the case of Nepal. Okay, I will try to take intersectional perspective here. So Nepal experienced 3 crises in a matter of 2 decades, right? First, we had Maoist insurgency, 1996 to 2006, resulting in 17,000 deaths, hundreds of thousands of displacement, and we know, women are impacted negatively in that. And we don't have to, and then in 2015, we had this earthquake, devastating earthquake, resulting in lives of around 8,000 people, and it impacted a third of whole population in Nepal. But it seems that we have not taken lesson from these 2 earlier crises, right? There were problems, right, in terms of hygiene, sanitation, providing food and shelter, and women-specific concerns. We already faced that, but it's still, after that, we have quarantine centers in Nepal that do not account for concern of women. There is no, like, in terms of toilet, in terms of hygiene and sanitation, there is no gender segregated living spaces. And this is not about lack of physical infrastructure. If we had paid attention to this, this could have been done. Because of this, women feel vulnerable. Some women are being raped in quarantine center, right? And a lot of women, they do not want to be in quarantine center in the first place because they feel insecure. And this is something not I made up. a lot of report is coming in media. And also I attended a webinar on experience of women leader during COVID-19. And this leader, they hear the concern, they get the phone calls from women on these issues, and they also say the same thing. The first case of COVID-19 confirmed that was confirmed on 23rd of January, and that was 29-year-old mother who had just given birth to a baby. And after giving birth, since there were not adequate sanitation, proper attention being paid while giving birth, she contracted a virus later, and because of that, she succumbed to death. As of today, 15,784 cases of infection and 34 deaths are being recorded because of COVID-19. And men infection and fatality rate, we still do not have gender disaggregated data, by the way. I tried to find this. I couldn't find. If anyone knows that, let me know, okay? And then men infection rate, as I showed earlier, is much higher. And as I mentioned before, this is a more kind of, a symptom of systematic and structural inequality. And as of 22nd June, 91% of infected were men in Nepal, okay? And there has been massive surge in, not massive, but you would understand why this is the case, okay? There has been surge in violence against women. There have been 604 cases of domestic violence against women in the first 2 months of lockdown. Lockdown started on 24th March. And this is 16% up from previous 2 months before the lockdown. And 61% of these cases of domestic violence against women are from own husband and family. And this is a report from National Women's Commission. But, however, in the first 75 days of the lockdown, 400 women committed suicide, right? That is 25% up from 2 months before the lockdown. And you can see why this is the case here, because you cannot report the case of domestic violence when your abuser is with you all the time in lockdown in 24 hours, right? So we do not have effective reporting mechanism. And also there are reports in media that shows that maternal deaths have increased in lockdown. So we have like previous to pandemic, we had 3 mother were dying when giving birth per day, and this rate has increased after the pandemic because you cannot do regular health checkup, you cannot go to the healthcare center, and you do not get regular supply of vital essential vitamins and vaccines. And hospitals, they suggest you to stay, have natural birth at home as much as possible because the hospitals are not safe place. You might get infected. And that has resulted in higher morbidity, higher fatality rate out of maternal death because of this lockdown. And there is no concerted effort from the government. That's reflected in case of management of quarantine center, and also some local organizations have provided a 24-hour helpline for any instance of domestic violence, but they haven't been effective. And this is province number 5 where I belong, and in this province, population of this province is 4.4 million, and In this province, 380 committed suicide in the first 100 days in the lockdown. 380, right? 3.8 per day cases of suicide, and more women women represent high number in this data, and most of the deceased come from poor backgrounds, farmers, wage laborers, and the trend is increasing over the time. The more suicides are being recorded, and majority of them are youth. In the 2 months after the start of the lockdown, nationwide, 1,105 people committed suicide. And there hasn't been any attempt to compile data based on their status and identities. And that's where I want to connect it to epistemic perspective. This is a kind of epistemic violence, right? Because we are not taking this thing seriously. This kind of pandemic, public health emergency, or any kind of crisis, they impact marginalized population, disproportionately, and yet we cannot find data, and that tells us about the priority, right? And then it is not that difficult to collect data. It's just that nobody cares, right? And then this leads to this epistemic violence. We treat these issues as non-issue, and that further perpetuates actual violence. And that's why I want to reiterate that epistemic violence is much dangerous, very dangerous, and we must pay attention to that. So finally, why make feminist sense of COVID-19? First, it is not only about having women on board, right? Yes, that is the first positive step, first positive thing to do, but that is not enough. Having women on board on itself does not reform the whole does not change the structure of inequality. And it requires formal and informal cultural change within institutions across all areas of global health governance. And secondly, gender inequality cannot be studied in isolation from other system inequalities. That's why we need intersectional approach. Yes, women are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, but women with different, at the intersection of different system of inequalities, for example, class, caste, disease, disability, ethnicity, geographical location, they compound their experience, they compound their suffering, right? That's why we see a lot of cases of violence against Dalits in Nepal, and recently there was a genocide committed against Dalit youth in western part of Nepal. So we must take intersectional approach to pay attention to these kind of inequalities and how they compound one's suffering and discrimination. And third, the hierarchy of political economy that does not include care work, and that always presents care work as something that is not very important. That must change, and care work must be recognized, it must be acknowledged, and it must be paid. And the final thing that I want to say is that to account for informal and invisible ways through which gender inequality persists, we must resort to feminist research methodology. So feminist research methodology here, it is very different from the positivist method. I can come back to this later. This is the whole presentation could be made on that, whole course can be done on that. But what I just want to say that the positivist method that focuses on a number data, yes, they are important, but they miss a lot of experiences of women. They exclude women and minorities. For example, looking at GDP, household income, it does not take into consideration care work, right? And it does not account experiences, stories of those at the margin. And when I say feminist research methodologies, I mean ethnographic studies, feminist storytelling, participants-based research. These kind of methodologies, they help us to get to the bottom of this kind of inequality and vulnerability. And unless we recognize there is this kind of inequalities, vulnerabilities, and oppression, we cannot have policies that address this kind of oppression. Okay? So, making feminist sense of COVID-19 accounts for these kind of different kind of discrimination and vulnerabilities faced by women, also such as LGBTQI community. There was LSE, and there was a participant from Pakistan who was talking about the experience of Hijra community, right? The transsexual community in Pakistan, who were facing this kind of discrimination after the pandemic. They were forced to, sexual harassment against them. So, feminist research methodology helps us to take into account this kind of experiences and inform policymakers about the possible steps that needs to be taken. Okay, these are the references. If you want to go deeper, you can find them useful. Okay, that's all from me. I'm looking forward to questions, comments and feedback from you. And sorry for the glitch earlier. This is so embarrassing, and this happens, right? And I never experienced that before. And I hope you will understand. Okay, back to Saqib.
Yeah, thank you, Keshab. Really nice presentation. It's clearly identify, and you just mentioned that what is happening in Nepal and how systematically women are victimized in the COVID period. It's like not the lockdown, not the COVID-19, and the after impact on women is very clear from the presentation. Right now, I open the floor for the audience. If you have any questions, raise your hand or just turn on your sound and video. You can have some. You can ask few questions to our presentation. Any questions from anyone, please? If you want to ask in Bangla, you can say Bangla as well.
Yeah, hopefully Akib and Saqib will translate that into English.
Yeah, sure. Students from Department of Government Politics and any other departments, and যদি কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকে বাংলায় তোমরা বাংলায় প্রশ্ন করতে পারো।
So I have a question.
Sure.
Thank you. My name is Arnob. I'm from the Department of Government Politics in Jahangir University. So I have a few observations and I think one or two questions. First of all, I would like to ask you that you mentioned that capitalism crumbles if gendered inequality persists, or something like that. My question to you is how, if you could, it's not a question, if you could clarify your point, because gender differences have been persistent throughout the history of humankind for thousands of years, and this form of capitalism, or this 19th, 20th century form of capitalism, it has not yet crumbled, given the differences between gender. So if you could kindly clarify your point. The second point is you talk about Dalit genocide. where I saw that only one Dalit kid or one Dalit child was, I think, massacred, along with 5 friends, I guess, and based crime. So I don't know how you can call this kind of a case genocide, because genocide is a term which is very sensitive, and I think we should respect the term. And there are various ways to respond to such kind of caste-based or gender-based crimes. I don't think genocide is the appropriate word. And then I would like to ask you, the final question is, what is the fundamental finding of your research? I mean, you have shown us the data, and we know that the use of data is ambitious, and it's also dangerous because there are thousands of variables which are needed to be taken into account, because there should be controlled environments and a lot of and hosts of variables, hosts of constants which should be taken care of. So what is your fundamental finding, and what is your recommendation? What should be done in Nepal? Because we can see that the data is available online. We can see that BBC has covered it. We can see that various local and global media have covered it. We can see that as early as March, April, May, people from researchers from China and other parts of the world have covered this kind of gendered inequality, or gender-based or caste-based or black, white, skin-based, I mean, complexion, race-based inequalities. But what is your fundamental finding in your research? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Arnob. Keshab.
Do I respond to it now, or the question?
You should respond now.
Okay. Thank you, Arnob, for your very good observation. And first thing I want to say that I probably shouldn't use the word genocide, but that's I should be really careful. I take that point on board, and I'm using that word because a lot of Dalit activists and they are using it. I must have mentioned that, alleged genocide, but I take your point, and we need to be really careful. But I have to respectfully disagree that there isn't any caste-based crimes. There are many, but a lot of cases they go unreported, and a lot of cases, they are very subtle, right? A lot of microaggression, you do not even bother to report it. So in that sense, I think that is still relevant, and it is also a lot of research show that these kind of discriminations, they get amplified when there is crisis, especially in public health emergencies. And then there has been this debate going on that, those Dalits, and there are different caste groups which are characterized as untouchables. And the pandemic is a different experience for Dalit. And on top of, coming back to your observation on there has been differences between different gender. I think difference and inequality are two different things. I think we need to be really, clear on that. And there is no gender equality, even if you look at the best role models, right? Best kind of egalitarian system we have, like Scandinavian countries. Even in those countries, there is no gender equality, right? But that does not mean that we should not strive for a more just and egalitarian society. And we should always raise this question. If we don't raise this question, then it will become invisible. And when it is invisible, it becomes non-issue, and we do not pay attention to. And just to give you an example, okay, I want to give you an example of Australia. There are like 5,000 cases of in domestic violence reported every week before the pandemic, right? And that equals to close to 260,000 cases annually. And majority of those cases are women. Men also suffer domestic violence, but women outweigh far heavily on this issue. Guess what? Only 18 million Australian dollar is allocated to fight gender-based violence. But if you look at fight against terrorism, more than 250 million Australian dollar annually, right, allocated to fight extremism. And guess what? In the past 10 years, only 3 cases of terrorism violence. So I think we need to change our ontological perspective. What is security, right? And if we do not, take a gender lens, I think we miss this very important issue. And your third point was that, again, that is a very good point that you mentioned, that I need to be really careful on analysis of data. I use data, and that's a very good point. And I'm not doing any positivist. I'm not using any positivist method. I'm not using statistical analysis. I was just showing you, sharing you some of the descriptive statistics, right? Just to highlight the magnitude of this issue. I was not doing any kind of statistical analysis. And on research, I haven't done this. Is a work in progress, right? Me and another colleague of me, Dr. Luna Keshab, we are working on this, and this is work in progress. We are still collecting data, and hopefully we will use feminist research methodology to get to the experience of people, of women, especially, suffering in this pandemic, and their experience. We are curious to know their experience. And also, I agree with you that we need to count to other variables. Right? I mentioned biological perspective, socioeconomic perspective, political perspective, and also epistemic perspective. And also, of course, there are other variables, and hopefully we will, take into account while, by the end of this research project. And thank you for your question, Arnav. It was a really good question.
Okay, Keshab, any more question for anyone, please? I mean, I have a little bit query as well. I mean, as you say, there are not a lot of funding, not enough funding, and why government is not spending too much funding on, because on gender-based discrimination? Because so far I know it's a problem that you have long ago and a long time, and also the cost as well. System as well. It also have, kind of carrying the problem in Nepal, in society as well. So, and also, if you look at Bangladesh as well, and even in South Asia, this sort of problem is common, and around the world, this sort of problem is common. But as I see that there are lots of research going on as well, and you show the data as well. There are, female is contributing a lot. Compared to other countries as well, in Nepal as well. And as I've seen while I was in Australia, and I have seen over the years that females in Nepal are more engaged in works and other things as well, lot than the man. So why government is responding? Why there is a shortage of policy response in Nepal?
Yeah, thank you, Shakib, for the question. Yeah, you are right that there's more, these kind of issues have been highlighted more over the years. That's true, right? That's because a lot of feminists, they have been, and then a lot of activists, they have been advocating for it, right? It did not came in vacuum. There has been long process of activism, and in case of Nepal, we had a Maoist insurgency, and what Maoist, one of the agenda of Maoist was, ending all kind of patriarchal oppression, right to inheritance, ending all kind of like oppression, oppressive practices to women, such as dowry system, chaupodi system, but they persist nevertheless, right? And we have a lot of gender equality clauses included in our constitution as well, but that's more kind of like formal sphere. In informal sphere, in kind of private sphere, and also in practices, these kind of changes haven't been haven't had a desired impact, desired effect. And I think it is difficult to get rid of, eliminate this kind of discrimination because it is so deeply entrenched into the system, right? It is so deeply entrenched so that some, a lot of discrimination is normalized. We take them as, normal. We do not question them. For example, I was, teaching, I teach gender and world politics at the postgraduate level here at the University of Sydney. And last year, in 2018, there was a group of a student. I was curious about what is the situation of domestic work burden in different countries, because the students come from diverse nationality, diverse background. And I was surprised to find that almost all of them, no matter whether you are in UK or in Australia or USA, women are expected to do care work, right? Cooking, even when you are earning money, when you are a breadwinner for a family, you are meant to do this kind of care work. And this is so normalized, right? If a husband tries to help out, then he is considered to be less manly, less masculine. And I'm just giving you one minor example. Of course, you'll find so many in different culture, in different country. So I think we need to keep, fighting for more equality in society. And one of the ways to, highlight gendered impact of pandemic, right? And then it is impacting all of us, right? Like I mentioned, virus does not discriminate between men and women and other gender, but not everyone experiences the pandemic, experiences the aftershocks of this pandemic equally. Some are more likely to suffer than the other. And only being curious, right? Cynthia Inloy talks about feminist curiosity. Only by questioning what is considered to be normal, by questioning what is not there, what is invisible, we get to, hopefully one day we get to, find out what are the causes that is perpetuating this kind of discrimination.
Yeah, thank you, Keshab. Any more questions, please? Anyone want to add anything? We have Professor Sajidur Rahman as well. Want to make any comments?
Yeah. Okay. I would like to thank Keshab Espas. It's such a nice presentation on COVID-19 impact on developing countries, especially on focusing on women. I'm Sajidur Rahman. I'm the faculty of the Department of Government Politics at Jahanginargar University. So I don't have any questions, but have some comments. Yes. So your present, yeah.
I love your comment. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. So like developing countries in everywhere, Bangladesh and Nepal are experiencing the same impact of this pandemic. More likely that Bangladesh and Nepal have some similarities of socioeconomic backgrounds and other things. So what I have is interesting. I got from your presentation that though it is said that this pandemic is similar effect to everyone. It's not counting any caste, class, or any other thing or gender. But now it is clear that though males our men are affected by this pandemic in higher rates, but the after effect, the women are affected more than men in this perspective. One thing I add, I think you can make inquiry more on that, the economic effect on women. There are some solo women families, single women families, and there are some breadwinners from who are the women. So they might be in the long run very much affected by this pandemic. In Bangladesh, we are seeing that there are more families who are not directly affected by the pandemic, but for the economic deteriorating profile of the country, the people have to leave the Dhaka city to the villages because their economic earning is closing, so they have no other way but to they are returning back to the village homes. So this must be a big effect for this people, because when a family is affected by for economic affairs, the women are the first to be affected very much by this any type of disaster. We have seen Bangladesh is a disaster-prone country, and in coastal areas, cyclones and floods are regularly affected our country. In these days, we have seen that women are more affected by those disasters, and these disasters affect the women in two ways. First is that you mentioned that sexual or violence in home, and secondly, the economic effect, impact of the disaster. So more research can be can unveil the other impacts of genders of this COVID, and similar type of research can be done in Bangladesh, because we are experiencing the same type of impacts of this pandemic. So I will, before ending my comments, I will thank you again for your very interesting and thought-provoking presentation.
Keshab, you want to conclude anything? Or
Yeah, Sadiq Rahman, and that's very sharp observation, and thank you for your comments. And I agree with you that Nepal and Bangladesh, we have a lot of similarities, and also Bangladesh is prone to a lot of natural disasters, cyclones, flooding every year. And I also agree with you that women suffer more. The aftershock, the secondary impact of crisis, natural disasters, or any kind of public health emergencies is much deeper on women than men. Okay, and also we need to change our ontological perspective of how we look at things, right? We are saying, we are basking on, in terms of Nepal, like we are basking on the fact that there are less fatalities, mortalities because of COVID-19, just 34 as of today, right? But a lot of, hundreds of other, people are dying from a lot of other causes, right? Pregnancy-related causes, and that they are not counted, suicide, they are not counted in tally. They do not tally to COVID-19 impact. Like if you add all those together, you'll find the bigger picture, right? So we need to change our ontological perspective, right? And same goes with the conflict. In my research, I look at conflict, and there is in conflict, there is a start point, start A, like 1996, and right, 2006. That is very narrow perspective, right? The impact of this kind of crisis is intergenerational. it does not impact on that generation, because if you lose your father and mother, in conflict, it's going to impact your future. It's going to impact your future of your children. So it has more kind of this intergenerational impact. I think we need to pay attention to that kind of impact in our research, in our analysis, and as a responsible researcher, we need to take into account this kind of different dimension of any kind of crisis. And also, I think economic impact of COVID-19 is huge to almost all the countries, and this is particularly devastating for Bangladesh, because a lot of Bangladeshi export is textile, and a lot of women work in textile industry, because there has been cancellation of order. I think I read an article a few weeks before the cancellation of order equal to $3 billion US, and that was the partial analysis. That was by conservative measures. And if you look at a lot of women are employed, and they all most of them, they're going to lose their jobs. And so the ramification of this pandemic is much larger and much deeper. And also, however, ugly the impact is, there is some positive kind of lining, right? Silver lining to this pandemic as well. A lot of people are there returning to, in case of, I can speak of Nepal, a lot of people are returning to villages, a lot of barren lands, which were left untouched, being cultivated, is starting to get, used for agricultural purposes. And a lot of young generation, they're returning back to their families, their villages. And hopefully that will bring a positive change. But I'm not, at this stage, it is too early to say, if that is positive thing or negative thing. We don't know. Definitely it looks positive. If the government can harness their energy, their enthusiasm for better, hopefully this will, a lot of third world countries like Nepal, who depend on remittance, this could be a long-term positive trajectory, but it is yet to see.
Okay, Keshab, thank you very much. As you said, the things a lot of people are returning to their villages, and same thing is happening in Bangladesh as well, because a lot of internal migrants who used to work in garments and who are in informal workers now going back to where they were in the villages. And me and one of my colleagues also writing a paper on this sort of things, on internal migration as well, and post-COVID impact. So I hope that we can share these sort of findings as well. I think, and you research, maybe we can maybe in coming days we can do a lot of cross-country analysis as well. That will be another interesting.
Yeah. That looks very tantalizing prospect.
Yeah. So, do you have any question anymore? Anyone else? Or otherwise we'll conclude. Yeah, I think we don't have any more questions from anyone, and we already take quite a bit of time as well. It's almost 2 hours, 1.5 hours. I really thanks to everybody for being with us for such a long time, and we are sorry again that we have some technical issues that it's happened in these days with the internet thing. We are getting used to it. I hope that it won't happen again. And we have another presentation on 18th, on the same platform, same time. If you are interested, you can join with us. And Professor Al-Masood Hassanuzzaman is going to present on this platform on democracy and COVID, these sort of things. So I thank everybody for being with us for such a long time. Thank you, everybody.